the objective of creation is that we should recognize that despite the level of concealment, everything emanates from him. Although there are many indicators that's not the case. Of course, we see that evil has the upper hand, and if everything would emanate from him, how's it possible? Nevertheless, to stay the course and not be distracted, understand that's all part of the challenge, not to be misled by many things that we see. And if you're able to recognize, despite all the roadblocks and the detours and the distortions, to recognize that everything comes from him, then you've succeeded in the objective of creation, which is that's called Yichur Hashem, that everything emanates from him. But again, nevertheless, we have the Torah and the mitzvahs. How do the Torah mitzvahs come into play? Without Torah mitzvahs, it's like a blind man groping in the dark. That we spiritualize ourselves through the study of Torah and we do mitzvahs, this gives us a sense, despite all the concealment and all the distortions, we're able to have a sense of what's right and what's not acceptable. But that's a challenge. Because nevertheless, not having that absolute level of clarity, due to we are physical beings, our physicality creates a certain conflict of interest and does not allow us to see truth as we should see it. Like we know, anybody has a conflict of interest, automatically it's a slight distortion of what reality is because of that conflict of interest. Every one of us have a conflict of interest because we are physical beings. Due to the physicality, whether it's ego, which is rooted in the physical persona of a human being, because that's what drives us. The ego, that is the greatest Achilles heel that we possess, and that's the real challenge. There's the me, there's the I. I've done enough, or why I have to know, and there's always the sense of entitlement. That all has to do with our physicality, but that's the challenge. To understand that there is no entitlement, that we've already exhausted all entitlements because whatever he's given us is beyond the pale in terms of what we're deserving. So if that's the case, as a result of that, we have what to understand it, put it in the proper context. So this is the objective of creation. And we had mentioned, it's interesting, the Minchas tells us that when a child is born, he does not have the tov, does not have a good inclination. He only has a negative inclination. Why? Because if they would start off at equal footing, a child, when he's first born, with a good inclination, he will never be conditioned negatively. Because if they start off at the same moment, good and evil, the inclination-wise, the person himself would definitely choose the good. But because the child is conditioned naturally, because of the negative inclination, and the positive inclination only enters into the child at the age of bar mitzvah. When he becomes of age, as a result of that, all the conditioning is negative. So therefore, there's literally, it's like pushing a boulder up a mountain. When the child becomes bar mitzvah, the challenge is a real challenge. As a result of that, choice is really in place. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a choice. If it's the good and evil would start off at equal footing from day one, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Evil will not succeed because the person clearly has no draw towards evil yet, and he sees good, he would gravitate good. But because the child already has been exposed to that inclination for all the years until bar mitzvah, therefore there's a real challenge. When you become an adult, become of age, when you become liable and responsible for your actions, now you have a challenge to make the right choice because now you have that conflict of interest embedded in your psyche, in your being. There's a rabbinical obligation that parents, definitely a father, has to educate and to condition a child in Judaism, in the Torah and the mitzvahs. As the Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us, When a child reaches the age where he's able to speak, you teach him 2 verses. Torah Tziv Elonu Moshe V'Roshei Kilas Yaakov, which is a verse in the Torah. The Torah was commanded to us by Moshe. It is the heritage of the congregation of Jacob. And the second verse you teach a child is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which is the fundamental of Jewish belief. That's the unity of God. Those are the first 2 psukim, verses you teach a child. Now the question is, the child has no comprehension. The child has just begun speaking, but those are the first words you teach him, these 2 verses, which these are the most important. This encapsulate and every aspect of Judaism, the Torah and our belief in the unity of God. Those are the first 2 verses you teach the child. So the way I understand it is that in terms of a child, when is a child able to begin speaking? When the brain has matured sufficiently that part of the intellect is able to form and verbalize words for the child to be able to express it. So that process, which is a physical process, it has to do with the brain. We want that the brain activity, the first expression of that activity, the process should be applied to these 2 verses. Why? Because that's a spiritualization of the brain. The brain is being spiritualized to be able to process those thoughts, because those thoughts, what are the most fundamental, all-encapsulating, all-encompassing thoughts, which includes Judaism and the what and the objective of creation. Those are the first 2 verses a parent teaches a child. And then as the child continues, he reaches a certain age, he's able to develop certain mechanical skills, you teach him other things, to take the lulav, to put on tzitzis, whatever it may be. Although the child has no obligation. But this conditioning process, which is only rabbinical, it's the obligation of the parent, the father for the child, was to counter, because since the child is naturally inclined to negative, it's crucial and essential to have a counter conditioning, which is not natural, to be able to what? To counter all the negative inclination. The Rambam writes in the Laws of Deos that although we're born with certain predilections and certain natural inborn characteristics, which aren't necessarily positive, through conditioning, we're able to establish a second nature. Those are the words of the Rambam. Some say what the Chazal, what the rabbis legislated, promulgated, that a parent has an obligation to begin training and educating the child, even from the very beginning, where the child has no comprehension, understanding what's being taught to him, but that conditioning process will become the second nature of that child, because the child naturally does not gravitate, is not inclined to something positive. But that's the challenge. Somebody once asked the Chazon Ish, who was a leading Torah sage, passed away in the early 50s, and made a comment that if we would have the Chofetz Chaim living in our generation, we'd be a different generation. And if we would live at the time of this person, due to that person's presence and his influence and his being the role model, the generation will look different. That was the comment the person made. So the Chazon Ish said that every generation has its challenges. And because there is no Chazon Ish, there is no Chofetz Chaim, therefore the challenges are different types of challenges. Every generation has its challenges. And whoever is put in place to be the players on the scene, it's within that context, that's the challenge of that generation. No 2 generations necessarily have the same challenge. As a result of that, the reason why there's no Chofetz Chaim is because there's not supposed to be a Chofetz Chaim. Because if the Chofetz Chaim would be here and his teachings and his presence and his dissemination would actually affect us in a way where that's not meant to be for us. Every challenge we have, it has to do with perfecting our soul. There are no 2 souls which are exactly the same. And if you meet the challenge, you spiritualize your soul in the way it has to be spiritualized. So why don't we have a Chofetz Chaim? The answer is because the challenge has to be a certain type of challenge. But whatever challenge we have, we were able to meet that challenge. And that's why it's so crucial and essential that when a parent raises a child, as a parent brings a child into existence, you have a responsibility to raise that child, to feed the child, to clothe the child, also to teach that child normally appropriate behavior, ethics and morals, and certain skills that the child should be able to function and be productive in his life. Productive, not destructive. So within the context of spirituality, the rabbis promulgated that the parent has to condition a child in the spiritual realm by conditioning the child, as I said, when he moments he speaks, mechanical skills. At every juncture of development as a child, the child is involved in studying. A father as a child has an obligation to teach his son Torah. The Talmud tells us that there was a time there were many Jewish orphans due to battles. This is in Romans times, during the Second Temple period. And there was a person who was a high priest. His name was Yeshua ben Gamla. And realizing that many Jewish children didn't have fathers to teach them and to educate them, he established an educational system that every community had to have a school, that children should be able to attend that school and be educated in Torah because they didn't have the parents to teach them because they had no fathers. And every detail of that Jewish education, that was part, he created the curriculum. And he had said like this, every Jewish town has to have a Jewish school to teach Torah. Every class cannot be more than 20 students. And it has to have a teacher, because you have more than 20 students, the teacher cannot attend to all the needs of those students. And if you have more than 20 students, the teacher, the rabbi, has to have an aide to assist him to supplement what he's not able to do himself. Once you reach 40 students, the class has to be divided. You have to have two teachers. So every child should have a sufficient amount of attention to be taught properly. Literally every aspect of the education he put in place. And the Gemara tells us that if not for this Yeshua ben Gamla, who was a high priest, Torah would have been forgotten from the Jewish people. That it was crucial that since these children had no parents, they were orphans, to teach them, to raise them properly. So the surrogate parent was the school. And the teachers who are well-versed in Torah and in teaching skills, they would teach the children who didn't have parents to teach them. But this is so crucial, so essential, because without the Torah, without knowing how to do the mitzvahs, it's like we're cut from the anchor, and we just drift. In terms of the world, we'll be totally swallowed up and subsumed by whatever the world is all about. What anchors us? What secures us? What gives us that rooting? It's the Torah and the mitzvahs. And only then can we meet challenges despite all the distortions and the concealment of God's presence in this world. Without that, we don't stand a chance. So the question which people ask, such as Larry and other people, what about if you didn't have the background? So why weren't these people lost to Judaism? They didn't have the parents who mentored them, who educated them, who even had entered their minds that this is essential in their children's lives. It was an integral part of their lives. So how does that happen? Everything in life, there's nothing random. And if a person is touched, despite not having that, that's God's intervention. That God wanted that person to have the opportunity, and people have many opportunities. Very often we have opportunities, but everything in life is choice. We gloss over opportunities. One person notices something, another person doesn't notice it. Why does one person notice something, another person doesn't? Because it was meant to be this person should find that lost article and the other person didn't see it. They just passed over, they didn't see it. Because God wanted one person to find it, the other person should not find it. Identically, in terms of there's enough indicators in this existence that we should ask serious questions, and those questions will bring us to an answer. But unfortunately, the parent raising the child makes it a lot easier because that person has the focus and has a sense of what that is. The other child doesn't. Therefore, God has to intervene and give that person, despite not having that mentoring, that conditioning, enough of a sense that a certain point in their life, they're going to make a decision. They're going to make a choice, which other people, it doesn't even resonate with them because they don't notice to even make a choice. Many years ago, I'm going back 38 years ago, there was a woman, she came from South Africa, and she attended a class of mine, this woman. And she was married to a Jewish man from South Africa. They're both South Africans. Husband was an accountant. And I didn't realize that she was a convert. When did she convert to Judaism? When she attended my class, she was a woman in her 30s. She converted to Judaism when she was a teenager. That's what she told me. Why did she convert when she was a teenager? Because she said even before when she was a child, she always had a certain yearning because she had certain Jewish friends in South Africa, in Johannesburg, and she had a strong interest, strong curiosity, want to be part of that. And as she got older, when she became a teenager, she started investigating and read about it, and she made a decision. When she was 14 years old, she wants to convert to Judaism. When she was 14, because she felt she had a yearning for this. She doesn't know why or what, but that's what happened. And she converted. And she became, I'm not saying she was a devout Jew, because she didn't have enough of a background education in terms when this happened in South Africa, but she wanted to be an appropriate Jew, whatever that means, being a Sabbath observer, although she wasn't learned enough to know how to observe the Shabbos properly. But nevertheless, it does make a difference. Why did she have that yearning? And somebody else doesn't have that yearning. Why? The Talmud tells us that any convert throughout history who converts to Judaism, their souls were at Sinai when God gave the Torah. Every Jewish soul, although it wasn't yet born into existence, every Jewish soul was at Sinai when God gave the Torah to the Jewish people. Not only Jewish souls, but even non-Jewish souls who were meant to convert in the future, whenever, even 2,000 years post-Sinai. If they're meant to convert, those souls were at Sinai exposed to that dimension of spirituality, God's presence. So I'm saying many things go back to that moment. We were touched then in a soul state, and therefore the things that we pass over automatically, we notice or they resonate enough to draw us into a level of curiosity to follow that line of reasoning. But again, it's choice, continuous choice, all along the path. You have the ability now, but you're no different than anyone else. Everything's choice. You have your challenges. We have challenges. And only because we have the challenges, that's why the value of the choice has that special value, because despite all the distractions and the negativity, you made the right choice for that reason. The Gemara says that you find very often converts have very, very difficult lives. They have complicated lives. Why? Because why didn't they convert sooner? They should have converted sooner. Right? Therefore, there's a claim against them, and they could have been there sooner, and they came later. It was due to their own choice that they came later. So there's a claim against them. Therefore, after post-conversion, they experience difficulty in their lives, whatever that difficulty may be. You find very often. Now, the question is, you have no obligation to convert. A Jew has no obligation to live as a Jew. A Noahide has no obligation to live as a Jew. But nevertheless, if God is knocking on your door and he's giving you enough sense or senses or sensitivity to realize that there's something going on, how did you ignore those messages, those subtle indicators that he sent to you, and you didn't make a decision sooner? That means you made a decision eventually, but there were endless indicators earlier which God was sending to you that you should have been there sooner. Why are you late? So for that delay in where you should have been, that's the reason why there's a level of liability and culpability to the convert who converts later. Because that's so, being at Sinai, it was embedded with a level of spirituality which was potential to develop into a full developed Jew. So why did you remain a Noahide, which is considered a non-believer? And even if you did keep the 7 Noahide laws, you're meant to be much more than that. As a result of that, there's a claim against that person. I told the story. There was a great rabbi. His name was Rabbi Elio Lapian Zecher Tzadik Levrocha, very holy rabbi. Passed away in the 60s at the age of 95. At the age of 27, he had Gilui Elio. Elio Novi came to him. That's how special he was, already at the age of 27. He himself was very special, had very special children, very holy family. And in his younger years, everybody thinks Jews were observant in Europe. I'm talking about pre-World War I. People thought everybody was observant. The answer is they were not. They were not. There were certain parts of Europe, like in Poland, we have Hasidic Jews, you have Hasidic communities, they were observant because they were connected, they were within that community. It was like a very insulated community. But among Russian and Lithuanian Jews, the vast majority may have been traditional, but observant not. They were not observant. And many of them were affected by the Haskalah movement. That was the Enlightened movement, which actually undermined and tried to sever a relationship to traditional Judaism. Even that, they were known as the Yiddishists, the Bundes, and they brought tremendous amount of damage to the Jewish people. And they ultimately became communists and socialists and anarchists, all these people. Because the religion Yiddish became the religion. It was no longer Judaism was the religion. So Rabbi Elio Lapian, when he was a man in his 30s, he would travel around Europe, visiting villages, looking for children, and he would meet with parents because there was always a synagogue there, or inquire if there were any special families there that maybe he will notice that he will encourage the parents to send their children to certain yeshivas which existed in Europe. Like there were certain known yeshivas, but people had no connection to them or had no interest or didn't even know what they were. And he would travel and try to locate these young children who were early teenagers, and to try to encourage the parents to send them off to have this Torah education. He comes to a certain community and he finds a family. This woman, she was the daughter of one of the leading Torah sages of that generation. Could you imagine? And she was widowed when she was a young woman, and she had 2 or 3 children, and she remarried. It wasn't so simple to marry a person who was fully connected properly to Judaism. So she married an enlightened Jew. So this woman, as I said, her father was one of the leading Torah sages of Europe at the time, and her children were enrolled, they called it gymnasium. Gymnasium means it was a school with secular subjects, no Hebrew subjects, and ultimately the child would be a secular Jew with some smattering of knowing he's Jewish, about more than that, not. And he comes and he meets this woman and he finds out who she was. He's like amazed. He's pained by it. Here, the 3 children in the family, the oldest boy is 14 years old, can't even read the Aleph base. His father passed away when he was 3, 4 years old, or 5 years old. And his mother had no choice. She was a widow. She married this man. And the man himself didn't value Judaism, that he should do something special for especially the not his children. So he meets the boy, the young man, 14 years old, And he's never met a genius like this 14-year-old boy. And I once mentioned, this boy at the age of 14, he ran a multi-million-dollar business in Europe. He had a network of hardware paint stores in a number of the towns in that area. And he was a financial genius. And he meets the boy, and he speaks to him, and he encourages him he should take off 6 weeks from his business and go to Telz Yeshiva. There was a community in Lithuania called Telz, and they have a high school. And he should attend that high school for 6 weeks, right before Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, spend 6 weeks there until after Sukkot. And the young man, and Rabbi Lapian wasn't an ordinary person. He was very impressive. And as much as this young man was a genius and was successful, he figured he'll give it a try. He could afford to leave the business for 6 weeks. He'll be in touch. He goes to the yeshiva, this high school. As I told you, he couldn't even read Hebrew, couldn't read the Aleph base. So they hired a tutor to teach him how to read. And they saw immediately, within the first hour, he caught on immediately. Not only that, within the first few hours, he could read. So they realized that the scope of his brain, when he would read, he wouldn't read one word at a time on a line. He wouldn't even read one line. He'd be able to see the whole page, and he could almost read the whole page simultaneously. That's how quickly his mind worked. That's the level of genius he was. Okay? So within a day or 2 or 3 days, he was reading Siddur. And they explained to him what davening is. Okay, he was there. Then they started to teach him Chumash. The young man was devouring it, and he had retention. And within a few weeks, he was in the highest class in the high school. That was his capacity. And then afterwards, he stayed for Shani Yom Kippur, very inspiring. It's a solemn time, this feeling, Sukkot, this celebration. So Rebelli Lapian thought he actually had it clinched. He's committed. Not so simple. Not simple. You think the evil inclinations would let such a catch go so quickly? Not going to let him go. So he says to the young man after Sukkot, so have you decided, do you want to stay or not? He says, look, I'm running a big business, and without me, it's not going to happen. I'm going back. So he was disappointed. Eli Lapian didn't give up so easily. Throughout the year, he kept in touch with him. It comes towards Pesach. He invites him to come back. And he says, why don't you come for this summer semester to study, around Shavuos time, to study in the yeshiva. This time, because he had the background already, and he was yearning for it slightly, that was the closer. He was able to close the deal. And he was committed to stay. Okay? He sold off his business for a substantial amount of money. Now he's studying, gave it to his mother, whatever it was. This person, he was in the yeshiva, he started outpaced the Rosh Hashivas in the yeshiva. You understand what kind of genius? At the age of 20, he was giving people in the 40s, 50s who founded the yeshiva, they couldn't deal with him. That was the breadth and depth and to what degree he advanced in the short period of time. And after he was there 2-3 years, he felt he had to leave. Why did he have to leave? Because he felt him being there, he'd actually undermine the respect of the students, the student body for the heads of the yeshiva. Because by seeing who he is, a young man, and they were no match, they couldn't deal with him, he felt best he should leave and go elsewhere, studies elsewhere. And he left. He became, pre-World War II, he was one of the leading Torah sages in Europe. This person. Eventually, post-World War II, miraculously, he survived the war. He was in the Kovna ghetto, survived the Kovna ghetto. He was in Paris after the war, and there were thousands and thousands of refugees of the war came to Paris, and he was the one who took them under his wing and created all kinds of programs, because the ones who survived were mostly teenagers. Anybody who was already in the 20s, 30s, they weren't able to survive the concentration camps. Only the teenagers who went in young came out, were able to survive, the survivors. And eventually he passed away in his 50s. He had no children. So Reb Eli the Apyan said about him that he was such a special soul, such a special person, and he did tremendous things in his life, Reb Eli the Apyan. It was worthwhile that he himself should come into this existence only for that person alone. That's the way he valued the degree of this one person that he was able to influence and give him that Jewish education. For him alone, he felt that was enough to come into this world. Everything else paled for that. Could you imagine? If you read about what he did in his life, this Reb Eli the Apyan, the Musar he disseminated, the Torah he disseminated, the influence he had on people, but he felt in terms of his own evaluation, this one individual had that degree of value that it was worthwhile for him to come to this existence just for him alone. That this person should become a Baal Tshuva. If Reb Eli the Apyan would have gone and traveled to look for such children who were denied because of circumstances, it wouldn't have happened. But it was meant to be that he should find them. So anybody who is meant to be and could be, there are always opportunities for those people to notice things, to be touched or whatever it may be. So very often the person chooses not to be touched. He glosses over it or has no interest for whatever reason. But there's enough reason to be interested. It's every person's choice to be interested, not to be interested. That's the challenge. Everybody, no matter where you are, you have an opportunity. Why didn't you notice? Because you chose not to notice at some level. But of course, the culpability, the liability to that person is less than a person who has the awareness, despite the awareness, like an observant Jew, when he chooses to turn his back on his Judaism. Over there's no question. The level of liability is much greater. Because here, it was clear to you at one point, and you chose to go another route rather than valuing what you had. The other person, he barely noticed it. He should have noticed, he didn't. As a result of that, the level of liability is much lesser liability for that reason. He points out something now, the Ramchal, the Talmud tells us, I'll tell you in Hebrew the term, HaKadosh Baruch Hu medaktik im tzadikav kechut hasara. God is exacting with tzaddikim, with devout people, if they deviate as much as a hairbreadth. Ordinary people, God gives them endless chances. Endless. If a person's truly devout, the moment he veers from the straight, narrow path, God is exactly with him. And the person gets the brunt of justice. You think just the opposite. I mean, he's the favorite son. The tzaddik is the favorite son of God. He's towing the line, doing everything right. So why does he have greater liability or culpability that God doesn't let him, the moment he deviates as much as a hairbreadth, and this is based on a verse, God reigns in on him. Why? And not only that, it creates a greater challenge for other people, right? This is tzaddik viralo. When a person sees a tzaddik, God reigns in on tzaddik. I mean, he's supposed to be God's favorite son. Is that what it's all about? People say, if that's the case, I prefer not. But that's part of a challenge for others. But why does God reign in on tzaddik if he deviates as much as a hairbreadth? Now, what is the basis for liability and culpability? What is the basis? Let's start off on that. A person could violate the Torah on many levels. What about a person's put in a position, he's coerced to cross the line? He has no liability whatsoever. A person's forced to eat non-kosher, force-fed non-kosher, no liability. Because the only reason why you ate the non-kosher is because you were forced. It's not attributed to you. What about if a person eats non-kosher? He thought it was kosher and mistakenly ate non-kosher. There is a level of liability to that person. Why? Because he did make a choice, but the level of liability is minimal because there was no intent. There was no negative intent at every level, any level. If he would have known, he wouldn't have eaten it. It's only because he didn't know, but nevertheless, since this action cannot be attributed to anybody else but his own inadvertency, therefore there's a level of liability. What about a person knows it's not kosher, and if you'd have something kosher, he'd eat kosher, but since it's not his desire to eat and satisfy that desire, he chooses to eat not kosher. There it's his choice. He should have restrained himself, not eat not kosher. He chose to eat not kosher. So that's called you violated willingly, knowingly. That's another. So the liability is much greater than the person not knowing that he was eating not kosher. What about a person eats not kosher and violates the Torah defiantly? What's defiantly? The Talmud says you have kosher meat of a kosher species, and you have a kosher species which is not kosher. And he can eat the kosher. It has the same quality. Everything's the same. But he says, I will not eat kosher. Because God says I should eat kosher. I will not eat kosher. I'm not kosher. That's called a defiant person. That's defiance. A person is defiant. That's the most extreme level of transgression. The liability is the greatest. That's called defiance. The other, he's not defiant. It's only because he felt he's entitled because he doesn't have kosher. But if he had kosher, he would eat kosher. There's liability, but not as extreme as the one who defiantly defies God. By choice, he chose to eat not kosher because God said to eat kosher. So everything is dependent on what? On intent. That's what it's all about. So I'm bringing out the point. So a person is what we call Chinuch Shenishba. He doesn't even know. He was brought up in an environment he doesn't even know to be a Jew, not to be a Jew. He has no idea. It's all purely a label for him. His level of liability is much less. And even if he had the indicators in his life, which he should have noticed, they didn't notice. It's like a person's traveling and you had a stop sign and it was slightly obscured because there was a tree. And he passes the stop sign. Understand? And a policeman's there, he's going to pull him over. And he says, once you stop, there's a sign. He says, I didn't notice it. He says, if you would have been focused, you would have noticed it. It's not totally obscured. It's slightly, you could see it. But because he wasn't paying that level of attention to see if it was, he just passed through it. He's accountable for that. Because there was enough to see that you could have seen it. In life, there's enough. I'll tell you a story. There was a person many years ago. His father was a communist. And he was raised totally not religious. He knew he was Jewish. And he had a grandmother who was a traditional woman. This was his father's mother. And he would visit her very often Friday afternoon. He was raised no Judaism whatsoever. And if you remember, in the 50s, most apartments, the kitchen, you had linoleum, and in the house, you had parquet wood floors. Parquet wood floors. That's most apartments with that in New York City. And every Friday, to honor the Shabbos, his grandmother would wash the floors. And she would take newspapers after she washed the floors, cover the floor, that people shouldn't step on the floor when it was still wet. And the newspapers would absorb the moisture of the mopping. Yeah. And people did this in those years. But at least it was a Jewish thing to do. He already was married, and he remembered his grandmother. Every Erev Shabbos Friday, she would wash the floors and put newspapers down. So he understood, evidently, and it touched him in a certain way, in a warm way, traditional way. It was like it was Jewishness. And that memory caused him, together with something else, which I'll tell you in a moment, to pursue Judaism. And he nearly became an observant Jew. He would travel from New Jersey for an hour every day by car. He worked in Midtown. He was an accountant for a real estate firm, and he would come every morning. The earliest one, he would arrive in the city at 5 in the morning, 5:15 in the morning. He'd be there before everyone else. That was his thirst to understand what he missed, what it's all about. He bought a pair of tefillin, so on and so forth. This man, he took advantage of that memory, which touched in a certain way, and then something else happened, which really got him going. He was an accountant for this company, and things turned south, And the owner of the real estate firm had to give a pink slip to the upper echelon of the employees because it cost them more money. And he, being a lesser echelon, he became the head accountant for the company. So he said to me, it's like, you're in the middle of the mountain, the top of the mountain falls away, and all of a sudden you realize you're on top of the mountain. That's the example he gave me. He's in the middle of the mountain, and to get to the summit, he would never believe he'd ever get there. What happens? All of a sudden, God shaves off the top of the mountain, and he's on top of the mountain. So the newspaper's on the floor with his grandmother. And this happening, it really touched him very strongly. And that really got him going. So I'm saying, this person, he took the lead, so to say. He noticed that other people take it or leave it. And people say, it doesn't mean anything, or whatever it may be. But God gives enough indication and that's part of the challenge. And if you take advantage and you notice it, and at first it's not so simple. And this person, eventually, he gave it up. Gave it up eventually. Life's not a moment, life's not a year, life's an expansive time. And the evil inclination doesn't let up. You think you're on top, he can push you right off the top, and you're back where you started. You never know where you are. You cannot rest on laurels. You have no guarantees. You're never secure. And you always have to have that keen eye to be aware that that moment, God forbid, could come sometime. And you have to be ready for it, for that reason. How did it happen? He went into his own real estate acquisition, and he took in some partners. And he did certain things that didn't make any sense. And the pawns he took in were observant Jews. And he did the wrong thing. He acted, he's still called the financial person, he's the accountant, and he didn't do certain things which were due to negligence. It was like an oversight, and people lost money. And they went, and he was ashamed, and they were upset with him. You know what he did? He turned his back, went right back. I'm just saying that's what happened. Nobody was at fault. Nobody drove him from Judaism. It was just the circumstance, what he was confronted with, because he had this oversight, and he was embarrassed for what he had done. He says, something? The easiest way to deal with it, just check out. That's it. Where he is, what happened, I don't know. But that's what it's all about. But continuously, you never left for a moment. There were always challenges. And as much as you think it's clear, what's clear today may not be clear tomorrow. That's the way it is.